right, everyone. I think we are live this afternoon for our Wednesday webinar. I have a couple different clocks in here. So the computer says it is 1:02, so we shall get started for today. We recognize there's a number of other meetings going on at the same time this afternoon. These Wednesday webinars are really meant to support you with the issues that you're facing right this very minute and give you access to us. So we record all of these. We'll post them to the website for what they're helpful to you for. But those of you who are logged in, we want to especially make sure we address any concerns or challenges that you are facing today, this very minute. These are kind of an in-between between assessment directors. A bit less formal. These are some items on this agenda that we thought you might be interested in and are prepared to talk to. For those of you who haven't participated via WebEx before, it's similar to the Adobe Connect system we used to use. In the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is a chat. There's a little arrow next to the chat. You can expand that. You can select who you want to send your chat to. So if it says everyone, that means all of us can see your chat. So you can ask questions that way. There's also the webcam and your audio that can be muted and unmuted, and we can see you and have a conversation. We do try and keep everyone muted while someone else is speaking so that we don't have cell phones ringing and school bells going off and people coming in to interrupt. So we do try and keep you muted while someone else is talking. But you are welcome to use the audio and talk during the webinars to ask questions and give us feedback and all of that. So with that, let's jump right in. I don't see any chats specifically with anything that's burning. Maybe you're interested in this first item, which is an update on where we're at with accountability. So sometimes we prepare PowerPoint slides for these, sometimes we don't. We actually do have some slides. Whitney, is that the first slide? There we go. Whitney has prepared some slides to give us an update on accountability. Tracy's making faces at me through the window. Tracy, do you want to join our webinar, friend?
No, they just got me covered.
Okay, you're good. All right. And Tracy says we'll talk about that in just a minute. You probably heard her. So Whitney Phillips is here with me to take us through where we're at with accountability right now. As many of you know, we released the preliminary school grades and then discovered that we had triggered the 65% rule. So Whitney will explain all of that for those of you who may be less familiar with that. It's kind of hard to give you transparency as we're running calculations because sometimes we are still looking at things as well. So there's a balance act there. So Whitney's going to take us through that. The grades have been changed because of the 65% rule. And I was just speaking with Deputy Superintendent Nye about an hour ago, and he was reviewing the substantial feedback that has come in from you all and your colleagues in the field. Apparently legislators have been hearing your feedback as well as board members. So that feedback is most welcome. If you have concerns with the legislation itself from 2016 on school grading, was it Senate Bill 149, something like that?
I have it on here.
Okay, Whitney's got it. The legislators, of course, control the legislation, but the board is actually considering what we're going to do with accountability somewhere between now and the board meeting ends Friday, we hope. So your feedback to board members is most welcome as well as they are considering the impact to you all. So Whitney's going to take us through this. Whitney.
We're going to measure. Thank you. Hi, I love being on camera. I wanted to go over just two changes. I want you to make sure not to get all of these changes mixed up. This only affects the state accountability system, the Utah grading schools. This does not affect the 65% rule, this doesn't affect, the governor's report, or it doesn't affect the federal report. So we're only talking about grading schools. We are getting some questions that are off topic a bit, but we will go back to those.
Yeah, we'll circle back through the questions.
We'll be talking about DLM soon. I have my contact information there if you have any questions, and like Julie has mentioned, this rule that I'll be going over, I think the board may be making that decision Thursday or Friday. I suggest that you contact your board members if you have a strong opinion either way. So I want to go over the legislation. Let's see. How do I go to next?
Just click right there.
Oh.
Other click. Oh, hang on. Sorry.
I only have a few slides to go over.
Okay.
Let's go back one more.
Here, how about I click for you?
There we go. So here is the rule. It is 53A-1- there's the link for it. You can look at the rest. It says for a school year in which at least 65% of schools described in subsection 1A or B. 1A refers to elementary schools, B refers to high schools. Of those that receive an A or B, once the board shall increase an endpoint of range described in subsection A or B by 5 percentage point over the previous school year. Now, let's go on to the next slide. Last year, the non-high schools almost made this threshold at 63%. We anticipated that they may go over this year, and they did by a lot. They went up to 74%. High schools were at 56% last year. We weren't quite sure what they would do, and it looks like high schools also increased past that 65% threshold at 66%. Let's go.
Sorry.
This is another topic. So because they could have actually, elementary schools could have met this threshold and not have affected high schools, but both of them have. And part of the reason that they may have, high schools in particular, have gone over this threshold is because of the new definition to sufficient growth. So we have here, this is also, you'll see the Utah State Legislator logo there because I want to be clear where this is coming from. The legislature also wanted us to calculate growth in a new way. If you recall, let's go to the next slide. You can look that up if you're interested. In 2015, also 2014, we measured, we defined a student to have made sufficient growth as those that had an SGP of 40 or higher. And so that was the only measure, all of those that made 40 or higher divided by everyone else, and that was the percent of growth points that you got. In this year, the same measure applies as last year, but there's an additional way of looking at growth. And that is, as you can see here, that a student meets a scale score target. The legislation was written out and we followed it the best we can, and let me show you how we came up with those target scores. What we did is we looked at the scale score in 2014. The scale score in 2014 on each individual content area assessment placed students in cohorts. You had to have the exact same scale score per the legislation. And then all of these students took the test in 2015 and SGPs were calculated. And we could see that of that group, we could see what scale score they got to receive the SGP of 40. And so we went from a normative measure to criterion, and so now we have a scale score. And I believe the intention of this legislation was to make this a little more understandable to teachers. I don't know if it has or will do that. So in 2015, we were able to have a target scale score. We looked at this retroactively because we didn't know about this new change, but we created a target. And in 2016, you could have made sufficient growth by actually receiving an SGP of 40 or above, or if you met that target based on the prior year SGP performance, then you would have gotten it too. It in no way does it disadvantage schools. It only can give you an advantage as far as points go with the accountability system. So regardless of the SGP, you could have made that. I want to show you on this next slide just one example. We have a very large Excel sheet that show all of the course, what is it called? Course, you know, going from one, yeah, course sequences. Thank you, David. This one is just third grade ELA to fourth grade ELA, pretty typical. All of these course sequences have at least 3,000 students. Some of these course sequences get more complicated as they go on. But you can see here that we have a scale score that they got the previous year, and sorry, the scale score that they got in that would have been 2014, and then in 2015, all of those students that got an SGP would have had to have gotten 200, and you can see it goes from there. There are certain limitations to the way that we are calculating this because of the legislation wording that we must follow. In the original way that we calculate growth, we try to use we use as many prior year scores as possible. Many of you know that the more evidence we have, the more test occasions that we have, the more reliable the data. However, this legislation made it clear that they wanted one prior year score, and so these estimates are not as reliable. However, we are following legislation and doing what we are told. So that's how they are calculated. If you, I know we have a video on our website about SGPs. Many of you already know about that. We have David, the voice, helped out with that. That explains the original way with SGPs, but we don't have this additional measure on there. But that would give you at least an idea of what SGPs are. And that would be the Accountabilities website. Are there any questions about the 65% rule or the sufficient growth definition? Hello. There we go.
Hi. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions. So Whitney, would you explain quickly what the 65% rule means? So since we've hit that number of schools that have an A or a B, how have the grades been recalculated?
Well, thank you for asking, Julie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This rule was a compromise with legislators who were very confused that 64% meant an A. And so they wanted to make sure that the bar kept going up and up. And so what happened is, I believe, maybe I have it with me. Oh no, I left it on my desk. There's grade ranges that are described in the legislation, and I believe for a high school, to get an A, if I'm correct in this, they have to have a 64% or higher. And so what happens, and it's a little different for elementary schools. I can't think of it off the top of my head. So what's happened is, since 65% of the schools have reached an A or B threshold, those point ranges move up 5 percentage points. So now we're looking at, and if it is 64%, it would now be 69% for an A, and it goes all the way down the list of the grade ranges. So whatever was a B before, that also goes up 5 percentage points. And I think it's a way, the intention was for the bar to keep going higher and higher, that there's always improvement to be made. There's no verbiage in the legislation that indicates that we will be moving the points down at any point in time. It also doesn't have any kind of language that indicates that if the measure of the points or the grades differs, just like it did with this sufficient growth definition, which did modify some of the grades and some of the points, that doesn't make a difference. So
so it's not a change in how the grades have been calculated, like to get the percentage of points earned. No. That's all the same.
That's
all we're doing is saying now you have to get more points to get an A.
That's right. You must have that 69% instead of 64. So everything went up 5 percentage points. One issue that's been brought to our attention is that in high schools in particular, had we not had this change of sufficient growth, our high schools would have still improved, but would have improved from 56% to, I believe, 62 or 6, just, I can't remember the exact number, but just under 65%. So if we had measured things the exact same way, they would have been that way. But because of this sufficient growth change, the points were somewhat inflated, and so we
made it easier to get more points, so then therefore more schools got more points, and we crossed the threshold, meaning we norm it back down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I know that there is considerable interest in making LEAs happy, and that we want, it's nice to know before you start a class or the game what number of
grading
points
scale is,
you need in order to receive an A, which might be one reason to prolong this increase of 5% to next year.
Right.
But
yeah, so there's been lots and lots of talk around here internally and on the Hill with our corner offices here at USBE, talking with legislators and board members. So it's in play. Whether or not this gets formally added to the board's agenda tomorrow and Friday is at Chair Crandall's discretion at this point. I know the superintendent and I has been very clear with impact we have seen with this coming to the board and to legislators involved with the legislation, specifically around grading schools. So yes, your feedback is most welcome, as it always is. Right now, the decision makers around how to implement this requirement of the law are the board. So whether or not, Teresa, you asked, is it best to send feedback to all of the board members? That's your call. You are certainly able to do that. That's an option available to you. I know that we've heard from some superintendents, however you all want to advocate your thoughts, concerns, recommendations regarding the situation that we're in. That's all welcome. It's interesting because I mentioned as we started, we ran all the grades, got them out to you as soon as we possibly could. Without saying, did we cross the threshold? So once we figured out we crossed that threshold, we've had to go back and do this recalculation, which speaks a little bit to the tentative nature of these preliminary results. We've gotten word through this process that some principals have shared those results with schools already, or with their teachers in their schools already, and had like these moments of celebration, which is totally understood because there's a lot of great work happening in the field that has gotten us to this point. But it's also a reminder that when we send out preliminary data for you to review, it is not publicly shareable at that point. And so, we have to balance this transparency with, the auditing process and giving you things early enough that you can help us audit them and review them, but being sensitive to some of the nature of that preliminary data. So it's an interesting situation that we are in right now. We're looking at the data gateway as well. I'm not totally clear with how the data gateway operates and who actually got access to these preliminary scores, how many of those user roles were able to see it.
And
So-
you should all know that the data are embargoed.
Yeah,
You
it's
shouldn't be
all,
sharing
it shouldn't be, this is not publicly available data till September 15th. So we are very much in the audit and review period, and everything at this point has an asterisk that it is subject to change, which in this case it has. And, I think Whitney's provided a clear explanation as to what has caused the change, but it's also, we have to wrap our heads around this. It's been a great exercise in seeing, how this law has played out, and hopefully you can understand. We've been trying to be very transparent with you to that end. So go team, we're all in this together, and eagerly awaiting how this is going to play out with our policy makers. So are there any other questions on the accountability side? I don't know, you're all very quiet on the chat so far. You can turn on your audio if you want and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat box. We'll give you a second to digest and see if there's anything else we need to hit on this topic. And then we're going to jump into DLM stuff. So I don't see anyone typing. So here we are. So thank you, Whitney. And
David.
are you going to hang out for a minute?
You get tattoo.
Okay. Do you have the webinar on yours? Not yet. How about?
It's closed.
Okay. All right. We'll just present the DLM stuff from here.
Yeah.
And then we'll figure out how we're going to do this transition as we go between meetings. Okay. So is that the first screen?
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
If
Okay.
you left click, you can drag it, and I may have just
Actually,
gone
the
too far.
I know the last screen.
Okay. There you go. Sorry,
Okay.
keep going. Okay.
Hi everyone. I'm David Slay. I'm a data specialist. I'm also going to be speaking quite a bit for Tracy Gooley, who is over special ed, who is not here at the moment. And one of the reasons I'm going to be talking about DLM is I know she's going out and she's starting to do a lot of training starting this Friday. And so even though we're not going to start any DLM testing until March, we've been trying to get students into the system so that when she goes to do these trainings, teachers can actually log in and use the system, that there are students there. And so I thought it'd be a good reminder about where the DLM data comes from, and to make sure that you can send it to us so that we can at least get it in for those trainings. And then at the end, I'll also talk about the 2016 data, so last year's data, and how it is available to you and in the next week or so you can review it and use it as well. So the only trigger for DLM data,
Oh no. Okay, hang on.
did I break it? No, that's nothing.
Okay, there you
Okay.
go. We're running it from there. Yeah.
Okay, the only trigger for DLM data is the 1% status in UTREX. Core codes do not trigger the student's eligibility. It is, if it's 1%, doesn't matter what the core code is. 1%, we were being asked about this yesterday, doesn't depend on anything else. It does, like, any disability type, any time schedule can be 1%. That's decided locally at your level. We just get a file that says 1%, and when that happens, we take them and we send them to DLM, not to SAGE. This is even the case where if they're in a SAGE core code, right? So that core code would normally generate 5th grade ELA, math, and science in SAGE, but in this case, because this student is 1%, it is going to trigger DLM tests instead. Okay, we have a couple of problems getting data into DLM, and I've been trying this week to get it going. One of the problems is that each teacher needs to have an email address on their account, and I don't have a way to get those. We don't keep those in any table or anywhere in our warehouse here at the state. So I take the ones that are already in Kite, which is basically the equivalent of, let's say, Tide in Sage. It's where all the test stuff is stored. And if there's ones that I still need that I'm trying to assign a student to, a lot of you enter teacher information into Tide, so I try and get the email address off there. I will contact you. So if in the next couple of months you get an email from me asking for a teacher's email address, that's probably the reason why I'm doing it. I might check the school's website to see if I can find the address, especially as we get closer to the testing window and I start to get more desperate about getting everything set up.
Click.
Okay. Otherwise, the bigger issue is that we don't know, based on Utrecht's data alone, where to roster students to. We try this the best we can based on the core code, but unfortunately, you can't always put the resource teacher in as the teacher in your SIS. And so we allow for overrides where basically you send me a file that says here's who the teacher really should be. And since it's all secure student data, we have to take care of it over MoveIt. Just a real quick reminder of how we try and figure out who the teacher should be. So we have a set of core codes called the Essential Elements core codes. You have to be a 1% student to be enrolled in an Essential Elements core code. Basically, if they're in one of those core codes, that's the teacher we're going to take. If you don't enroll a student in one of those core codes, then we will take anyone that matches the test subject. So whoever is an English teacher for that student, that's who we're going to say should be their teacher for English in DLM. Then we have some increasingly arbitrary tiebreakers. Whatever was the earliest entry date, whatever is the lowest period, so we take the first period in the day. And if for whatever reason they have two first periods, which sometimes actually happens, I guess, then we take the lowest section number. So the point being, we are aware that we are not, once we get down to that level, we're not getting necessarily the right teacher. That's why we have to allow for these overrides, which again I mentioned will take place via MoveIt. So if you need one of these, if the correct teacher goes and looks and they can't find their students in Kite, email me and we can start the override process so we get the right student in. And that is my email address for those who didn't know it. Otherwise, I wanted to say just a couple things about the 2016 data, which are that the individual student reports, or the ISRs, are currently available in Educator Portal. But they are only available to those with building and district level access. They are unfortunately not available to teachers. So what you will have to do is either, again, figure it out at your LEA, get the person who has building level access to download them and give them to teachers, or you can handle that at the district level as well. Otherwise, we also have received aggregate reports for how each district did and each school did. From DLM, and we'll be posting those on MoveIt in the next week or so. So any questions I can answer regarding DLM? Again, since a lot of you won't even be testing until March, it's just kind of something to start thinking about, don't have to get ready yet. Although I will say, one of the places Tracy's going to do a training at, they haven't even sent any 1% students in Utrecht yet, and so she had to write them and say, when are you guys going to do this, because I'd like to train you, and they have to be in there. Just a reminder again that the October 1 deadline is the first big time Utrecht has to be right. So your Utrecht specialists are probably going to be working very hard this next month to get data correct.
And David, that 1% field, that's in the Scram record, right?
That is in the Scram record.
Right, yes. So if that makes a difference, that's the special ed file, that's the special ed record for students. Mm-hmm. So it's not in the same place where core codes are housed. It's just, these different files get merged into Utrecht's for an overall student record.
Right,
so,
and with that in mind, it's possible you can send part of all the files in Utrecht. You could be sending student records, you could be sending course records, and that's actually the case with this particular district that Tracy had to let know, hey, you're sending everything else in Utrecht, but you haven't sent a Scram record yet. So none of these students are coming through as 1%, and we're not getting any of them in. So there will be nothing to train your teachers on next week.
That makes sense. So I'm sure there's some way that the DLM data exchange could be more complicated, but it's hard to imagine how.
Oh, they're finding new ways.
New and innovative ways to complicate the data exchange with DLM. Excellent. Well, it's pretty quiet on the chat.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions? It's exciting that the reports are available, so you'll definitely want to be getting into the educator portal that DLM houses, get those downloaded, get those sent to the schools so that that can be communicated to students and teachers. Those results from last year that have already been wrapped into accountability calculations and
Right,
there you go.
and we also, again, as a reminder, we already sent them in a spreadsheet form over Move It.
Right,
that was about a
right.
month ago. So you've had them for a while. This is just another way. They're nice to print. They're colorful. They have drawings on them. Oh, not drawings. I guess charts and
Things, cartoons,
All right, yeah.
occasionally. Okay, awesome. Thank you, David.
No, thank you.
Let's see, what else are we talking about? Is that all you guys were planning on talking about?
Oh, I have.
David, if you wanted to fire up your computer